When we start working on our first Excel sheet for our nonprofit, there is two things that we need figured out. The first thing is the tables, and then the second thing is the relationships between these tables. An example here is we have one constituent, John Doe, and then we have two donations in the donations table. So these are the tables now. And then this is the relationships between these two tables. We're saying John Doe made two donations. The first thing we need to do is to identify all possible data types. Basically, what kind of tables do we need to have? What data do we collect? What data do we log into this Excel sheet? To do this, I need you to know and think of this. Any data that would have multiple instances of, this needs to be a table. For example, we have constituents. This is a table because we have multiple instances of constituents, multiple constituents. We might have multiple donations, then this is also a table. We might have multiple events, then this is a different table. And we might have multiple attendance. You see, we have a table for events and we have a table for constituents. And one constituent might attend multiple events. Since there is multiple instances of this attendance, then attendance needs to have its own table. Let's look at some of the common examples of tables that you might need to have in our Excel sheet. So we're going to have a table for constituents. This is going to have information like first name, last name, phone number, email. We're going to have another table for donations. This is going to have information like, and when I say information like, I mean columns. We have a column for donation amount, donation date. If you want to have like an expected date and then an actual completion date, it depends what type of columns you want to add. It's up to you. Now, let's also think about the relationships as we talk about this. We're going to look at relationships in a second. But since we have now two tables, one for constituents and another table for donations, we need to know which donations are coming, like who is the donor for these donations. So we need to relate donations to constituents. So there must be some type of relationship between these two. We'll look at this in a second. The next table is soft credits. Who are we soft crediting? To answer this question, like who are we soft crediting, then we need to create a relationship between soft credits and constituents. Which donation are we soft crediting? Then we need to create a relationship or a link between soft credits and donations. Similarly with refunds, we're going to have a table for refunds. Which donation are we refunding? Then we need to create a relationship between refunds and donations. Who are we refunding? Then we need to create a relationship between constituents and refunds. Sometimes, I like to ask these questions to help us think about the relationships. But as you build relationships, some of these relationships have the information that you need, and you don't need to do a lot of relationships. And let me simplify this a little bit. We mentioned earlier that for every refund, there is a relationship to the donation. And the donation itself is related to a constituent. So I don't necessarily need two relationships, one between refund and constituent and another between refund and donation, because one of them is sufficient. That is the relationship between refund and donation. This one is sufficient because donation itself is related to the constituent. So we can find out who the constituent is from that one relationship. Another table we have is the pledge. And a pledge, we need a table for the pledge in order to group all of the donations that are part of this pledge only. A donor might commit to making, for example, 12 donations, one donation every month for the next 12 months. But then throughout this year, they might make other donations, individual donations that are not related to a particular pledge. To tell the difference between which ones are part of a pledge and which ones are not part of the pledge, we need to have a standalone pledge table. And then we relate those donations to this pledge to know which donations are fulfilled and which ones are not. Another examples we have are tributes. So who are we tributing? So we need to have a relationship between attributes and constituents. And sometimes a donor might donate $100 and they would say, I'd like to split it into two halves, 50 for this person, and then the other 50 is in memory of this other person. So because it is related to a particular donation, then we need a relationship with the donation table. We have a table for events. We don't necessarily need to relate it to anything now, but then with the event attendance, we do, because we might have a table for event and then another table for the constituents, but then every constituent might be attending multiple events. That's multiple instances of event attendance. And then we have a table for programs, and similar to the event attendance concept, we have the program enrollment concept. We have the programs table, we have the constituents table, and then we have the enrollment. Which constituent is enrolled in which program? One very important factor and key, something that we must do and a lot of nonprofits don't do that, is that add an ID column to every single table. You just add like some ID at the beginning, and then just Excel auto increments every time you add a new row. All right, let's look at an example for relationships and how relationships work. The relationships basically is very tied to the idea of having an ID. Let's look at the table down here first. This is the constituents table. We added an ID column. This is the first column. It says C-001. It's up to you how you would like to name it, as long as it just auto increments. And then this is the donor's name, first name, John, last name, Doe, and then the email. The email works as an ID just fine. It's just sometimes we have constituents that don't have an email in the system, and the way to identify them is through an ID. So this is the first table. Now the second table is the donations. Now we received a donation from John Doe, and we might have multiple John Does in the system, and we need to know which who is the person that donated. We need to link the donor to this donation. The way you would do this is you would have your regular donation columns, the donation amount, the donation date, and then you need to say or identify who the donor is. You would have a donor ID column, and in this column you would enter the donor ID, the constituent ID. These two additional columns are helper columns. You can add these two columns with a VLOOKUP or an XLOOKUP function to automatically go and pull the person's name from the other table, the person's email from the other table, so you don't have to do that yourself. This is not necessary. You don't have to do that. It just helps with the readability and make it easier to know who that person is without having to navigate back and forth between two sheets. So relationships is basically just adding an ID column to the table. Let's look at another example, and that is the event attendance. Before we talk about the event attendance itself, we have a table for events. Remember, same concept. We have an event name. We have Giving Tuesday, for example. The ID of a Giving Tuesday is E-001. It's up to you, again, how you use the IDs, as long as it increments. We have Giving Tuesday, but we had Giving Tuesday last year. We had another Giving Tuesday. We're going to have another Giving Tuesday. So if you were to use the name, then you might end up with multiple entries. Which Giving Tuesday are we referring to? But if you use an ID, there is only one. So we have multiple events, and then for every event, we have an ID and a name. And then we have the other table that we looked at earlier. That's for the constituents. Now, the third table is the event attendance table. In the event attendance, you say which event it is, who is the attendee, and the attendee is basically the ID. You notice we are pulling just the IDs of these two. You can add additional helper columns in here. Next to the event ID, you can add the event name, and that automatically pulls the name of the event based on the ID using a VLOOKUP or an XLOOKUP. And then next to the attendee ID, you can also add a couple of helper columns similar to how we have done earlier, where you have the name and the email next to it. This is only to help you not having to navigate back and forth between sheets just to make the data visible in here. However, the needed information is the event ID and the attendee ID, and these two are sufficient for us to know which attendee you are referring to and which event you are referring to. On the event attendance itself, the table, you can add additional information like if this person was present in the event or not, what was their role. We said earlier that one person might be attending multiple events, and as a matter of fact, one person might have multiple roles in the same event. So if one person is a speaker and a coordinator in the same event attendance, we could approach this in multiple ways. You could have a role for speaker, another role for coordinator, a third role for speaker and coordinator. Alternatively, you could create one record, one row for them as a speaker, and then another role, another event attendance row for them as a coordinator. The latter one might make us think when we do a count that there is more attendance than we actually thought. If we are counting the roles, it counts the roles correctly. You know, we're counting the roles. But if we're counting the attendance, then the first approach is a better approach. This is everything for tables and relationships. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week.